welcome everyone to this morning's session on the value of open access books. We'd like to introduce ourselves as the co-chairs for this session. I'm Katie Sylvester, Open Access Books Manager at Cambridge University Press. Do we have James on screen? My co-chair, joining remotely? Yep, James.
And I'm James Watson, Open Access Books Lead at Taylor & Francis. Apologies for my unplanned virtual attendance. I've managed to rupture my Achilles tendon, and so now unfortunately confined at home with a leg brace and crutches. We both also co-chair the ALPSP Special Interest Group for Open Access Books. The Special Interest Group has been established for 1 year now and includes over 40 members from a range of different publishers, including those with established open access books programs and those who are interested in starting one. The value of open access to ensure the widest possible dissemination and impact of research is well documented. Our open access books at Taylor & Francis, for instance, on average receive 14 times as many views and downloads as a comparable non-OA title in the first 12 months after publication. However, the total number of research books published open access remains in the minority, and there continues to be distinct or amplified issues to publish open access in the books world. These challenges include issues around funding, author buy-in, lack of funder mandates, and implementing new open access products and workflows. We're delighted to introduce our three excellent speakers who bring together a broad range of experiences and perspectives on both the value of and challenges for implementing open access options for book publishers. Christina Drummond is Executive Director for the OA Book Usage Data Trust and based at the University of North Texas. Joe DeVille is Managing Director of the Open Book Collective and Professor at Lancaster University. And Pat Gordon-Smith is Commissioning Editor at UCL Press, which was established as the UK's first fully open access university press in 2015. Our three speakers will highlight the specific areas they feel open access is adding value to both publishers and the communities they work with, discuss how to maximise their impact, and address some of the main obstacles that need to be tackled to achieve a sustainable open access future.
In common with the world of academic journals, finding business models that work for OA books has been a challenge for most publishers. Gold OA is fairly embedded for books at this point, and almost all big academic publishers offer that route to open access now. Understandably though, not all authors have access to funding for Gold OA, and that's why publishers have begun coming up with other ways to fund open access books, often involving collective funding from libraries that allows a list of books to flip to OA if enough funding is raised. At Cambridge University Press and Assessment, ours is called Flip It Open, and we're about to hear from Joe and Pat about how the Open Book Collective and UCL Press's OA models work. After the three presentations, we'll have a panel discussion to cover some key areas of common interest, and we'll leave time for audience questions at the end. So first up, I'd like to welcome Christina Drummond as our first speaker to give us an overview of the OA Book Usage Data Trust initiative.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you to ALPS for this invitation to speak to you today. So as Executive Director for the Open Access Book Usage Data Trust, I have the privilege of working with a global network of stakeholders who are looking to better exchange higher quality interoperable usage data to help inform this conversation of value. But I also happen to be a researcher at the University of North Texas, and I started my career in the space of social science, law, and policy. So as we get started today, what I'd like to note is that when it comes to defining what we mean by value, I'd like to use a frame that we always encounter in these sectors, which is, it depends. So what exactly does it depend on? And I think it's important for us to start today by recognizing that this term of value is incredibly subjective. It's dependent on who is the one who is seeking that value. Not only the person who is reporting it, but who is receiving that report, who is looking to make actionable decisions based on these value indicators. As you see here in the slide, we have a number of ways that we talk about this already in books, and I've been very lucky to have funding from the Mellon Foundation and the U.S. National Science Foundation to bring together stakeholders and focus groups and workshops to explore these topics. And what we've learned is that people don't only, the authors, the funders, don't only want to get those reports on impact. And what do we mean by impact? Is knowledge being transferred? Do we have reach to our intended audience, or perhaps global or unintended audiences? What are the citations, and how do these works actually impact future works? There's also, though, the value for internal decision-making, as I expect you're going to hear more about this session. And finally, I think it's important for us to note something we often don't talk about, which is the intangible value that you heard surface in our keynote yesterday, where we had an individual's life impacted because they got a book when they were in grade school. These are all indicators of value, and potentially indicators of the value of open. And the question is, how do we describe it? For whom are we describing these values? In what context? Because context matters. And that context, of course, is often comparative, so making sure that we can make those comparisons in a trusted fashion is key. Through our research, and you'll see there are 2 QR codes on your screen to 2 different reports, we're able to bring together stakeholders to explore some of the needs for this value data, and also some of the challenges that face people bringing it together when in open access for books, those books are hosted across multiple platforms, not only publishers, but aggregators, discovery services. So if you think of all of the places that books go when they are open, you need to pull that information together to talk about its true value. It's not too far off from syndicated usage, which we'll talk about in a moment. The key here, though, is for all of these, there are 3 things that you need to be able to trust that the metrics you're relying on to tell the story of value is true. First of all, you need to have standards. It needs to be interoperable. So when you're comparing that information and pulling it together from across platforms and services, you know that you are combining them in a trusted fashion. Context, of course, is important as a second, but then the data that you're relying on has to be trusted. And so whether you're talking about the performance of a book and using usage as perhaps a proxy for sales, whether you're recruiting authors because you're talking about the reach of your open access publishing, these value indicators signal or provide a signal that has to be trusted. Whether you might also be looking at kind of how your OA usage can impact or inform the decision to make print editions or translated editions for certain markets around the world. At the end of the day, whether it's reporting or it's these internal decisions, the metrics indicate a value that is very important to have kind of a solid grounding, a trusted grounding, if you will. The key, though, when you're pulling this together from platforms and services, to recognize that these metrics can be sensitive, can be proprietary, and the more granular we get, in some cases, if we're talking about usage, for example, it includes IP address level data, which is included in a lot of privacy directorates, and you start triggering things like GDPR. We recognize in the NSF-funded workshop, which is the second report on that screen, of key stakeholders across not only the funding agencies, but a number of our infrastructures and publishers in this space, that usage data itself could be made more fair. Fair as in open science, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But that as we pull together this information, care principles also are something we could consider. And for those who don't know the care principles for Indigenous data sharing, this talks about the collective benefit of use, the authority to have such use, and responsibility and ethics behind the use of a particular set of data. So I like to say that we have to be fair and care to share when it comes to this kind of usage. I do think it's important for us to reflect, given the diversity of many of your programs in the room, that as we're talking about these book value indicators, and usage, of course, being the one I'm most familiar with, there's this question of how much of the processes and workflows that support this trusted value, how much of that is similar to what we're seeing for journals as we enter the world of syndicated usage, or open data for that extent, because all of these scholarly outputs need to tell the tale of how open access is having a positive impact. We've been gratefully funded by the National Science Foundation in the US to start exploring where those similarities and indeed differences lie both in the vocabularies and how we talk about usage and impact for these open outputs, with work being led by Jennifer Campos-Stratos, but also in the workflows and data supply chains to support these value metrics. And that's work that has been led by Laura Ritchie and Michael Clark. Some of you may have seen me present before some of the book data supply chains, which is the report on the left there with QR code, but we now have that same thing for open journals and data. So one thing I do want to note here is that as we talk about trust, one of the things that has come out of our work, looking at how we support the exchange of data, is that the quality of a value indicator can really vary based on a number of different metrics. To start with something simple, accuracy, adherence to a standard. I presume all of you in the room know what counter is? Yes? I see nods, great. That's not always the case, which surprises me, which means there are some individuals out there that are reporting usage statistics that is not adherent to a standard. Some may be counter-conformant, but not certified and have gone through the audit. Each of those levels can indicate a different level of quality or trust, if you will, in that value indicator. Other elements that you see here on the screen that have a similar kind of range of trust include how transparent the processing algorithms are for certain values that are put forth, the consistency of those calculation methods over time, the reliability and frequency of having access to these indicators. Is it something that you can pull on demand to inform your decision making? Is it a report that you get that's static in a quarterly fashion or monthly? That matters to some of these use cases. The other thing I will note is the granularity of the data. You heard me mention raw analytics, but right now we're often talking in aggregate levels, and I like to think of this as a proxy to census data. How granular you can get depends on how we balance that against ethics and privacy, but I think it's an important conversation to consider. I do have the absolute privilege of working with a global set of stakeholders to explore a lot of these issues, specifically for open access book usage data, to understand how we can address some of the challenges of pulling this data together across stakeholders across the world. And to the point of the open access book usage data trust, which I know is a mouthful, we often call it the OAIBU, which is our little French owl in the top corner. What we are trying to do is to facilitate the exchange of data from those who create usage data metrics of all flavors and varieties, recognizing all those indicators we had just mentioned. But to get that information from those who create it to the many who rely on it, the innovators, those who are creating the reports, those who are creating the data analytics, tools and resources to get this information into an actionable framework that people can work with. And so we're very lucky to be entering a proof of concept where we're building an international data space, which is an interoperable model that's come out of European Commission funded work through Horizon Europe and Gaia X, to facilitate this exchange and to facilitate truly the data governance, sharing and use agreements, and the very complex compliance requirements that come along with sharing sensitive, proprietary, and potentially privacy impacting data. I'm excited to note that in the coming year, we'll be exploring how to take this data space and extend it to support knowledge graphs and to support the evaluation of open access funding models with different networks of stakeholders. And so I will end my comments here with just a note that if that's something you'd like to participate in, please follow up with me after this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, is that okay?
Hello all. As you can see, Pat Gordon-Smith, UCL Press. I'm delighted to be here to be part of this this presentation, and I want to thank everybody for asking me to come and speak about UCL Press's model. I'm going to talk very, very specifically and as quickly as I can to all of the points that I've put here, rather than wandering off too much. As you can see, UCL Press is part of a broad international movement committed to open science. There was a movement that has sort of spread across the world from Europe and certainly into here and has created, sort of increasing amount of excitement and enthusiasm, but then we had to make it work. So we are forced, also we are traveling towards practices of academic publishing that are radical, in which researchers generate the content, and so therefore they should maintain all rights to their work. And we at UCL Press leave writers with all of their rights. I know that somewhere that isn't possible for some publishers, but it is definitely part of the vision that we're very keen on, which is primarily to be a service for writers and for readers and for the academic community. We publish quality research that isn't restricted on grounds of niche of interest or length. And when I say niche, we, for instance, published a book which is a grammar of Paraguayan Guarani. It's not my book, so I'm sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong. But we wanted to publish this whole series of books on languages that are dying, and we felt that that would be a very good, talking about value, we felt this would be a very good subject for publication in OA, because the likelihood that these books would sell well was very small. They've done fairly well worldwide. That one has been downloaded 16,000 times since 2020. And although that is not in itself a justification for doing it, it is a justification for our feeling that these books really do have value and can be out there in the world and do great work. Then we're looking at, obviously, other elements of our sense of feeling that open access is important for the community and that taxpayers have already paid, that the research findings can have more impact if they are seen globally. And we're seeing all of our books downloaded everywhere in the world, in every single country and territory of the world. And I'm sure that's the same for any of you who are publishing in open access. And obviously, for libraries, we're hoping to make a shift from the point of purchase, so spending to fund researchers, rather than to buy publications. But, I mean, that's an incredibly difficult step to make, because funding streams, as you will all know, come in different ways, and we haven't quite worked out yet how that's going to be possible. Very, very quickly, UCL, primarily, it's plugged into UCL's wider aims for open access generally. It's a university-wide commitment. There is an open access department that also enables publication in other publishers, and that's been incredibly important for UCL Press, because it means we have really solid grounding, we have funding, but we also have the commitment of the university's leadership. And very, very quickly, as you'll see, we concluded that in order to be successful in open access and to really, really make the case for open access publishing, it had to be fully professional. So we're staffed by professionals, and have as personal a service as we can for authors. Right, I am skipping through as quickly as I can. As you'll see, we were very keen that this should be a successful publishing business, as I say, to make a case for open access publication. And we feel that we're getting there. We've published 350. In fact, I think I looked, end of August, we published 361 books. And I know when I look at Taylor and Francis, and I look at Cambridge and Oxford, obviously it's very small by comparison, but we feel we've made a really good stride into there. We have textbooks, we have journals. We're also actually seeing not terrible book sales, which I think was something that was feeling that if there was a fully open access publisher, that they wouldn't be able to sell. But I think worldwide we're seeing that is happening. There is a take up. We were from the beginning absolutely committed to publishing in arts, humanities, and social science, because that was the area that was least well served for open access publishing. And you can see where our sort of specialisms have generated, really, and that was largely self-generated through people coming to us, and these were clearly the areas that were feeling that they would most benefit. And we're led by UCL's research interest, but I mean, not entirely, and we will welcome all pieces of work. So I'm going to move on quickly. How long have I got now? Probably about 3 minutes. Yes, okay. Gabbling away. So I'd just like to talk about the Open Institutional Publishers Association, of which UCL Press is a part. It's a collaboration between 18 OA presses and also JISC. And it's very exciting. We have a really wonderful collaborative way of working. And as you see, there are various different models. And so UCL Press is an outlier as a press that is fully funded by the university. And then we have the University of London Press and Goldsmiths Press that are predominantly OA, but they will publish some traditional materials because they are not getting full funding from their universities. Fantastic Open Library of Humanities and Scottish Universities presses that are examples of the networks of libraries that are basically joining together. And I'm guessing, quite a lot of you know about this. They join together to enable the funding for open access publishing within those universities. It's very exciting. Scottish University Press has just employed its first commissioning editor, professional commissioning editor. So that's another way of working it. And as I say, Queen's University Belfast has joined. They're literally, I think they're coming to their first book or thinking about it, and they're looking for help from us. I think I'll have to stop there. Thank you very much.
Is this your phone? Hi, everyone. So I'm Joe DeVille. I'm an academic. I'm also a publisher. I founded or co-founded a very small open access, diamond open access press called Mattering Press. So I wear different hats, but the hat I'm mostly wearing today is I'm also the PI on an ongoing funded project, which follows on from a previous project, which was, some of you may have heard of it, titled COPIM, standing for Community-Led Open Publication Infrastructures for Monographs. This was a 3.5-year project funded by Arcadia and Research England that, as it says there, this is from the original grant application, sought to address the key technological, structural, and organizational hurdles that we thought were standing in the way of the wider adoption and impact of open access books. So I suppose we, as a group, like all our speakers here, I'm sure, don't need to be convinced of the value of open access books, but we identified and thought that there were some significant barriers standing in the way of, I suppose, the maximization of that value. That project ended in April last year, and then since then we've been working on the follow-on project, which is called Open Book Futures. This is actually an even larger project, and in many ways is trying to maximize the impact of some of the work that we did on that first project, including thinking about how books can be more fairly and sustainably funded, more widely distributed, more durably archived, more accessible, and more experimental than other kinds of scholarly books. That's reflected in the kind of different areas of work that we are undertaking in the project. So I'll be talking in a second about Open Book Collective. Open Book Collective and a second part of our project focusing on Opening Future. These are two different ways of thinking about how we can generate new funds to support diamond open access long-form publishing. Opening the Future is a revenue model aimed particularly at medium-sized publishers looking to transition to a more open forward model. If you have any questions about any of this, please come to see me in the breaks. I can't cover it all in my remaining 5 minutes. Tote Open Metadata. This is a non-profit platform that makes it far easier for open access presses to distribute their metadata, to get their books found and discovered and read. And of course, that is an important part of the value of open access books. We're also working on workflows to make it easier for publishers to deliver accessible ebooks for those with diverse needs and screen readers and so on. And also new workflows to make sure that open access books can be preserved for the long term. And then finally, experimental publishing. One of the things that I am always really keen to argue is that open access books as a born digital format, offer all kinds of ways of, I suppose, making a case for the importance and the strength of open access as a publishing model. So there's all that happening. I'm not going to talk about most of it, though. Instead, I'm going to talk about this, Open Book Collective. So as So I'm the managing director of the Open Book Collective. The Open Book Collective was founded last year, and as I mentioned, is interested in generating new revenue streams for open access book publishers. Our model, and this Pat already alluded to some of this kind of work, and builds on and extends the Diamond Open Access membership funding model. So this is a model that has been used for a number of years by publishers and by different organizations in both a long form and journal publishing space to generate funding, renewable annual funding from potentially dozens of universities to support not publications, but publishers or publishing operations or journals. Some examples are there. We've got two publishers in that group. Top left is Punctum Books, a California-based Diamond Open Access publisher. And then just to the right of that is Open Book Publishers that Pat already mentioned. That has been using this model for a number of years now to really generate far more reliable funding streams for them as a publisher. And we have a number of other models there. The challenge is that this model is difficult for a publisher that is not using it, and particularly for a smaller publisher to scale up. And that's where the Open Book Collective comes in. The Open Book Collective currently has 12 members. They include Diamond Open Access publishers, publishing 100% of their books open access. That also includes service providers, infrastructure providers that provide the important back office functions that we think are really important to sustain open access book publishing. And also recently had 3 new university presses join us, ULP, University of Westminster Press, and Leuven University Press, which is really, really pleasing to see. We'll soon be having a 4th alongside a 3rd service provider. So it's worth saying that this model is aimed at particular kinds of publishers. It's aimed at publishers that are really deeply committed to open access. We have a threshold that a publisher that they can be a hybrid press, but they have to demonstrate how they can potentially, over time, get to a point of publishing at least 75% of their books, of their frontlist books, open access. So, how does it work? Well, we are harnessing, I suppose, the benefits of collaboration over competition. So, one of the things is that the kind of Diamond Open Access model that I mentioned earlier on is very difficult for a small publisher to kickstart. What we do is we take on the work of running that kind of model. We do the outreach, we do the invoicing, we do the payment processing. And what that does is it really democratizes this kind of model and opens it up to publishers to whom it would previously, there would be barriers to entry. Using this model, we then support non-BPC-based open access publishing. Many of our publishers still use BPCs, but we are encouraging them to move away from that in the long term by using the funds that we can supply them. We think BPCs, or a predominantly BPC-based model, generates all kinds of inequalities in the scholarly system, and therefore are looking to think about other ways in which we can sustain open access long-form publishing. The Open Book Collective is a charity, and also an advocacy organization. We do a lot of our work is arguing about how we can support a more bibliodiverse publishing ecosystem. So how have we done so far? So we currently have 79 supporting library members, and that number is growing. We've raised over £750,000 so far, over around about 90% of which goes directly to our members. The rest is then used to sustain our operational costs. As a charity, an important part of our work is also issuing grants. We just completed the first call for applications to our Collective Development Fund programme, and we will be issuing £90,000 worth of capacity building grants by 2026. We'll soon be announcing the first 5 recipients of our grants. These are small grants. We have a criteria that at least 30% of those grants must go to beneficiaries in lower middle income countries. In actual fact, in our first completed call, we expect around 70% of that revenue to go to beneficiaries in lower middle income countries. Of course, it's really important that we can sustain ourselves without access to grant funding. It's not going to be straightforward. There's a lot of work to be done, but we think we are on track to become financially self-sustaining by the end of the current grant, which is by April 2026. Thank you very much for your time. Please do stay in touch. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. So we were going to have a brief discussion with the panel, and then we'll go to audience questions. So a question for all of you to start us off. Can publishers continue to support multiple funding models, and which type of model is likely to be the most sustainable? I don't know who wants to pick that up first.
You know, because you sent these questions to us a few weeks ago, and I was looking at it again on the train up this morning going, honestly, I'm not sure how to answer it. I don't know how to answer it. Because all publishers have different access to different potentials. And I think we're all basically trying to do what we can and what is available to us. I mean, our ways of working, you know, is sort of...
Very different.
I mean, immensely different.
Yeah.
So I guess, consequently, there have to be a lot of different models. Otherwise, there's no potential for it to work. And as UCL Press's main interest is that open access should grow and continue, then I guess we need to support the idea that there will be lots of different potential ways of doing it, even though, as Joe has said, we all are most keen on facilitating diamond open access in terms of how we're both working.
Yeah, I mean, obviously so much depends on contextual changes. You know, I'm speaking at an event next week on the funding crisis in higher education, how that all feeds into things, and then we also having, funder mandates and so on, and of course that is all going to feed into this. I guess the one thing that I would say is that, I think, so my field, I'm a sociologist, and particularly I'm a science and technology studies scholar, and we know that within organizations there tends to be a lot of sort of lock-in the sense that organizations tend to get used to a particular way of doing things. And these different revenue models pose questions, I think, about the way that things have been done, where costs are spent within a publishing operation, where energy is exerted in thinking about things like business models. So I would, I suppose, encourage publishers to be open to change. And yeah, I think that you potentially can run different models alongside one another. So, for example, the Open Book Collective funding model could, in theory, run alongside a kind of subscribe to open type model for a hybrid publisher that is moving from a kind of closed model, that really has that ambition to move from a kind of closed model to a predominantly open model. So I think there are ways these models can be combined, but it sometimes does take work. It might involve analyzing your backlist, finding out whether, if you're doing a sort of subscribe to open model, and that does require an allocation of resources. So perhaps in the kind of budget lines, thinking about that as well, I think would be important, particularly for the larger publishers.
Christina, any?
Well, and I would just add to that, while we're going through this phase of understanding how the different models fit alongside each other, which do fit, which don't, there is so much evaluation going on. And for organizations internally to be thinking about what is that data that you need to understand what's working, what isn't, how they fit together, we're at a point where that's not clear yet, and we don't necessarily have consistency across our ecosystem on what that is that we're looking at. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity here for, again, collaborative research to figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think at Cambridge University Press, we have two models at the moment, and I think it's hard to look very far forward because you're always responding to the landscape and what authors want and what funders are asking for. But at the moment, we're supporting two models, Gold, and then we've got Flip It Open, and there may well be others in future. And I think it's just an evolving landscape, isn't it? James, I don't know if you've got anything to add from Taylor and Francis.
So I think today actually have relaunched our revised Pledge to Open model as well. So there's definitely a lot of, as we said, lots of different models out there. And I think it was interesting to hear from Pat the fact that, well, actually, we do need lots of different models because there's lots of different publishers who have different needs, different audiences, and different markets. So a one-size-fits-all approach probably isn't suitable. And when we're trying to promote, bibliodiversity, we probably do need different models. So it was, I think it was good to hear that confirmation that, we're not necessarily looking for a one-size-fits-all for all publishers.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I think, so we don't run out of time.
I was going to say, just quickly adding, I mean, that we all know that the problem is where the funding comes from. And if there was, if there was more funding available, we could, sort of maybe look for more diamond diamond potential, but as it isn't there, and as you say, as there's a funding crisis in the universities, we have to sort of have a relatively broad church in the way we think about it, I think.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. So we've got 10 minutes for audience questions. If anybody in the room's got any questions, we've got a roving mic. There's someone over there, and then James is going to keep an eye on the app. I don't know, James, has anyone put any questions out, or if you have got any questions at home, please put them on the app.
We do have one question, Katie, on the app.
Okay, should we we've got one in the audience here, and then we'll go to the app next, shall we? Hi.
Hi, this is Tasha from Counter Again. Still not a question about usage metrics, though normalization is the way to go. You were talking about UCL having textbooks, and I would really like to know what your experience has been with those sorts of open educational resources, because we all know that libraries have funding pressures, but students equally are really struggling with the cost of commercial textbooks in a lot of cases.
Well, I'd love to tell you about our experience, but in fact, we've only just launched our first one. I know I said we've got 7 textbooks, but that was a little bit of a lie. We had textbooks within our general monograph program, and then we are now publishing, I think, our second real textbook as part of our textbooks program in the next month or so. And this has been a very specific aim, actually, from from UCL and UCL Press right from the start, but it was very, very difficult to get it done because it's difficult for us to encourage academics to write textbooks when they're not going to get paid. But they are basically being done to, at the moment, it's UCL courses. So they're being written by UCL academics to specific courses there. But we are then obviously sort of looking for adoptions elsewhere and to move it out so that they would be useful elsewhere. And certainly the whole point is to enable students to access their textbooks without having to pay, and also primarily to enable libraries not having to stock large numbers of them. So we're very excited to see how it's going to go. The first one was on was heritage research methods, and yeah, as I say, excited about it.
Should we go to the question from the app now? James, do you want to read that one out?
Sure. Given the amount of funding for Diamond that comes from university libraries and the significant cuts in funding they now face, how sustainable is Diamond, and what do presses do if this funding goes away? Is this now a real risk?
Does anybody want to take it, Joe?
Yeah, I can have a go at that one. I mean, it's a very good question. I suppose one of the things, so I mentioned that the Open Book Collective is also, involved in advocacy, and we are, and part of that advocacy work is advocacy to libraries to think about their budgets, think about ways to build in sustainable funding for diamond models in their budget. So Sheffield University Library would be a good example of that. Dedicated, I think, around 5% of their budget to fund diamond models, and then aiming to increase that over time. And of course, that might mean thinking about some of the subscription agreements and that they have as well. So I think there are trade-offs within a university library, and I think one of the things that we'll be talking about at the event next week is about those kinds of trade-offs. In a funding crisis, the one kind of assumption would be that would be kind of bad news for Diamond, because libraries are going to remove their kind of luxury spend, on nice projects like diamond projects, perhaps. But I suppose you can also think about that might actually prompt libraries to think about some of their subscription spend and think about perhaps reallocating some of that spend towards diamond models in the context of shrinking budgets. I don't know which way it will go. I just think it's an interesting kind of thought experiment to think about that with libraries as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Anybody got anything to add? I think it's from a publisher point of view, it's obviously difficult if you're relying on that funding to flip lists, either front list or back list. But it's a question of you can't plan these things over the long term, and obviously library budgets do fluctuate. Do we have any other audience questions? Oh, there's...
Madeline Hatfield from Yellowback Editing and Publishing. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I was interested in maybe a tension that came through a little bit in Joe and Pat's presentations, in that there's the kind of institutional context where a lot of OA publishers, new presses are setting up in an institutional environment where there may be restrictions. There are lots of hoops to jump through to achieve things. And Joe's also talking about the experimental potential of OA books and the different kinds of models that could be used. And I think this also connects also to the question of value. How do we measure the value? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how presses can balance those sort of tensions and explore that a little bit more. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that when I mentioned in my gabble, trying to get everything out, OIPA at the end of it, the Open Institutional Publishers Association. And it's really interesting there to see the different pressures that you know, libraries largely that want to publish it are having. And it's I mean, if you are interested, it would be a very good place for you to go and find out more, because we have a range of experience there about what's happening. As I say, UCL Press is an outlier, which is great, and we've sort of shown that open access press can be successful, but obviously the investment by UCL has been huge. And so, other smaller presses have different pressures on them, where they maybe have the university wanting them to publish, but they don't know how to get the money. They don't know how to sort of develop from there. So I think actually, if you were to join the conversation there, that there's lots of learning going on, very collaborative. I mean, Joe, you were at the OIPA meeting, weren't you? So we're all just sharing ideas and helping each other on. And in terms of value, again, I mean, UCL sees it absolutely as core value in terms of providing this service and advocating for Diamond open access. But again, it's whether other universities can afford that investment.
And yeah, I just quickly answer. So, I mean, I suppose one of the, so I mentioned we had this sort of work package on experimental publishing within the project, and I suppose one of the reasons that we have that there is to show that open access books can really push the boundaries of what we consider to be a scholarly text. And I think for most of our publishers, there's not really much tension, in that respect, in the sense that actually we get authors coming to us wanting to do things that they can't do in kind of conventional publishing workflows. And that then in turn allows those publishers to really showcase the possibilities of open access publishing, where content can be reused in different ways, where you can host different kind of media in different ways. The very form of a book can change over time, or depending on different usage cases and so on. So I think there's actually a whole scope to actually use that as a way of, often I think when we talk about open access, we're talking about how a publisher can, or an independent publisher or a small publisher can meet the quality standards of a larger publisher. And I think our publishers all certainly do that. But actually, I think what open access really does open up is that possibility to, I suppose, rethink actually what the scholarly book is and what it can do. And that's something I think our authors in general value. And I don't think it necessarily conflicts with the kinds of institutionalized assessments of value that tend to circulate in universities.
I think, did we have one more question, Libby, at the front? We've got the mic, and then that'll be just in the front row here. That'll have to be a super quick question answer.
Yeah, that's okay. So I was just interested, thinking about what Jake was saying yesterday with regard to AI, and I was just wondering if, what are your predictions for the value that AI is going to bring, specifically to books publishing?
Any thoughts from a usage point of view?
Yeah, well, I'll go ahead and start. It's interesting. I'll say this. When I started my journey on this project 3 years ago, there were conversations around whether usage data itself could be made fully open. And that quickly depended on who you were in the landscape. Were you public? Were you commercial? Where is your organization based? And if you extend that to AI, then there were a lot of concerns around how could this information potentially be used, not just for good, but potentially result in a harm to an organization, to an author, et cetera. And so I think as we look to AI, we're in this middle with respect to some elements of usage data and really metrics writ large, where we're thinking now more carefully about how do we control those flows of data, as opposed to just making them open, so that we understand the use cases and the applications and build in that authorization workflow, if you will, that parallels the legal side with data sharing and governance. And so I do think it's getting more complex, and there's going to be a lot more layers for those of us on the publishing side to work with the other elements of our offices that are thinking about how that data is shared and used once it leaves our office, which is very different than what we do on the content side, where we want it to be open and free.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks everyone. Just want to say a big thanks to our 3 speakers today. Thanks for coming out and taking the questions. And there's now going to be a 5-minute break to change rooms, and the next session in this room will be session 6A, Deconstructing Journals, Reinventing Research Communication. Thanks very much.